At 94, Clint Eastwood breaks silence about Gene Hackman. There are men who fill a room simply by entering it. Not with noise, not with performance, but with weight. With the kind of gravity that doesn't ask for your attention, it simply takes it. Gene Hackman was one of those men. Clint Eastwood is another. And for most of their lives, both of them chose to let that weight speak for itself, without explanation, without ceremony, and without the kind of public sentiment that Hollywood tends to dress itself in. That's what made this moment different. When news broke that Gene Hackman had been found dead in his Santa Fe home, Clint Eastwood, a man who has spent 9 decades saying only what absolutely needed to be said, chose to speak. Not as a director, not as a legend measuring another legend, but as something rarer and more human than either of those things. As a friend who had just lost someone irreplaceable. The day the news arrived, the story did not unfold the way these stories usually do. There was no prepared statement from a publicist. No carefully worded announcement timed for maximum dignity. There was simply a discovery, quiet, delayed, and deeply unsettling in its details. Gene Hackman, 95 years old, and his wife Betsy Arakawa, 64, were found dead inside their home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The property, estimated to be worth around $3.3 million, sat in the high desert landscape that Hackman had chosen as his final retreat from the world he once dominated. The circumstances surrounding their deaths raised immediate questions, not because there was evidence of violence, but because the scene carried the particular stillness of something that had gone unnoticed for far too long. Investigators believe the couple may have been dead for nearly 2 weeks before anyone found them. The dry desert air had already begun to affect the condition of the bodies by the time authorities arrived. Hackman was found in a mudroom just off the kitchen. His cane and sunglasses were on the floor nearby, suggesting he may have fallen suddenly, without warning, without time to reach anyone. Betsy was discovered in a separate room, on the bathroom floor, with an open bottle of prescription medication nearby. One of the couple's 3 dogs was also found dead inside a closet. The front door of the home had been left open. Authorities described the scene as initially suspicious, though they later clarified there was no clear evidence of foul play. No gas leaks were detected. No visible wounds were found on either body. The full picture would take time, and some of the details might never be entirely explained. But what lingered, what quietly devastated everyone who heard it, wasn't the mystery. It was the isolation. The idea that one of the greatest actors who ever lived had spent his final chapter in deliberate solitude, and that when the end came, it came without anyone nearby to witness it. For Clint Eastwood, the news did not arrive as a headline. It arrived as a wound. 2 men who understood each other without saying so. To understand what Gene Hackman meant to Clint Eastwood, you have to understand what Eastwood values. And what Eastwood values, above almost everything else, is authenticity. Not the performed kind. Not the kind that announces itself. The real thing, the instinctive, unforced truth that either exists in a performer or it doesn't, and no amount of training or technique can manufacture it if it's absent. In more than 6 decades behind and in front of the camera, Eastwood has worked with some of the most celebrated performers in the history of cinema. He has directed Meryl Streep and Hilary Swank to Academy Award-winning performances. He has collaborated with Morgan Freeman, with Sean Penn, with Tom Hanks. He has seen greatness from every angle. And when he was asked, or when the moment demanded it, he said that there was no finer actor than Gene Hackman. That is not a casual statement from a man like Clint Eastwood. It is a conclusion. The 2 men came from the same generation, born in the same year, shaped by the same post-war America that valued toughness over vulnerability and action over words. Both understood that what you didn't say often mattered more than what you did. Both had built careers on a kind of masculine restraint that the modern industry has largely moved away from, and both carried a presence that didn't depend on charm, didn't rely on likability, and didn't need the audience's approval to function. But even within that shared framework, Hackman stood apart. And Eastwood knew it. The film that proved everything. In 1992, Clint Eastwood directed Unforgiven. It is by any serious measure one of the finest westerns ever made, a film that didn't simply revisit the genre, but interrogated it, stripped away its mythologies, and forced audiences to sit with the discomfort of what those myths had always concealed. Eastwood played William Money, a retired killer pulled back into violence by poverty and circumstance. The role required him to carry the entire moral weight of the story, to embody a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and had spent years trying to be something else. It was among the most demanding performances of his career. And then Gene Hackman walked onto that set. He played Sheriff Little Bill Daggett, a man who believed, genuinely and completely, that he was the force of civilization in a lawless land. He built his own house. He kept order through fear. He meted out brutality with the calm certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether he was the good guy. He was, in his own mind, entirely justified. Here is a fully original 3000 word script based on the themes and story from that transcript. Hackman made that contradiction feel natural. He didn't play the villain with the kind of theatrical menace that signals to the audience how to feel. He played him as a man, a specific, complicated, entirely believable man, whose cruelty emerged from conviction rather than malice. That distinction is everything. It is the difference between a performance and a character. And Hackman inhabited the character so completely that you forgot, watching him, that anyone was performing at all. Eastwood's directing style had always been built on efficiency. He ran lean sets. He preferred 1 or 2 takes. He did not want actors who needed to be coaxed or explained to, who required emotional preparation or extensive discussion before they could deliver. He wanted performers who arrived prepared, who understood their character before the camera rolled, and who trusted themselves enough to commit fully on the first attempt. Gene Hackman not only met that expectation, he exceeded it in a way that apparently surprised even Eastwood. From the very first take, Hackman had the character fully formed. There was no searching, no hesitation, no moment where you could see the actor trying to find the role. He simply was Little Bill Daggett, completely and immediately, in a way that allowed everyone else on set to respond to him rather than prepare against him. Co-stars described working with him as a kind of unspoken challenge, not a competitive one, but an elevating one. When someone is that present, that prepared, and that committed, you either rise to meet them, or you fall behind. Most people rose. One actor recalled that when a last-minute schedule change moved a complex scene earlier than anticipated, Hackman executed it flawlessly on the first attempt, with no visible sign of pressure or adjustment. He had done the internal work so thoroughly that the external circumstances barely registered. Eastwood described him as intense and instinctive. He said Hackman never hit a false note. That film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Hackman won for Best Supporting Actor. And Eastwood, watching from behind the camera and in front of it, formed a judgment he would carry for the rest of his life. The actor who refused to be liked. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get discussed enough in conversations about acting, the courage to be genuinely disliked. Most performers carry, somewhere in their work, a need for the audience's affection. Even in villainous roles, there is often a softening, a moment of humanization designed to ensure that viewers don't fully turn away. It is an understandable instinct. It is also, in many cases, a limitation. Gene Hackman didn't have it. Before he became an actor, he served in the United States Marine Corps. That experience shaped something in him that no amount of subsequent fame or success seemed to alter, a fundamental indifference to approval. He carried himself with the quiet firmness of someone who had already decided what they believed and did not particularly need you to agree with it. This made him dangerous on screen in the best possible way. In The French Connection, he played Detective Jimmy Doyle, a man whose aggressive, reckless methods were almost as troubling as the criminals he pursued. Hackman made no attempt to sand down the character's edges or signal to the audience that they should sympathize with him despite his flaws. He played the flaws directly, honestly, and completely. He trusted the audience to handle what they were seeing. He trusted them to understand that a complex character didn't need to be excused to be compelling. In The Conversation, he went even further inward, playing a surveillance expert consumed by paranoia and isolation, a man slowly disappearing inside the architecture of his own fear. There was nothing appealing about the performance in a conventional sense. There was no warmth to cling to, no relief from the enclosing dread. There was only truth, rendered with devastating precision. By the time of Unforgiven, this approach had been refined over 2 decades into something almost philosophical. Hackman did not play characters who happened to have flaws. He played people, fully realized, internally consistent people, who existed entirely on their own terms, without apology and without appeal. The result was a body of work that could not be ignored. Not because it demanded attention, but because it earned it. The man who chose silence. In an industry defined by the desperate maintenance of visibility, Gene Hackman did something almost unthinkable. He left. Not gradually. Not with a farewell tour. Not with a series of lighter, smaller projects designed to ease the transition. He made his final film, walked away, and never came back. No cameos. No late career reinventions. No television series to remind audiences that he was still there. He was not still there. He had chosen to be somewhere else. He moved to Santa Fe, far from Los Angeles, far from New York, far from the machinery of the industry that had defined his professional life for 50 years. In the high desert of New Mexico, he built a different existence. He wrote novels. He stayed physically active. He kept his days quiet and his public profile invisible. When he did speak, in the rare interviews that punctuated his retirement, he showed no interest in being commemorated. He did not speak about his legacy or his significance. When asked how he hoped to be remembered, he said he wanted to be seen as a decent actor. Someone who tried to portray each role honestly. That's it. That was the aspiration. Not greatness. Not immortality. Not the respect of the industry or the love of the audience. Just honesty consistently applied across a career that turned out to be one of the most remarkable in American film history. For Clint Eastwood, who continued directing well into his 90s, who remained creatively active long after most of his contemporaries had stopped, this represented a different kind of choice, one he clearly respected even if he didn't share it. Because when Hackman stepped away, he didn't do it in a way that suggested defeat or exhaustion. He did it with the same conviction he brought to every role. He decided he was finished. And then he was finished. No further discussion required. What Eastwood said. When the news reached Clint Eastwood, he did not stay silent for long. And when he spoke, he was, as always, direct. He said there was no finer actor than Gene. He called him intense and instinctive. He said he never hit a false note. And then, in a moment that revealed something deeper than professional admiration, he added that Hackman had been a dear friend and that he would miss him very much. That last part matters more than it might initially appear. Eastwood is not a man who uses that kind of language without reason. He does not offer emotional declarations to fill space or manage public perception. When he calls someone a dear friend and says he will miss them very much, he means it with the full weight of someone who has spent a lifetime saying only what he actually means. It tells us that whatever began on the set of Unforgiven in 1991, that unspoken recognition between two men who both understood what real work looked like, continued beyond the production, beyond the awards, beyond the decades of separate lives and separate choices. It persisted quietly, the way things do between people who don't need to constantly reaffirm a connection to know that it's real. Morgan Freeman, who co-starred in Unforgiven alongside both men, described working with Hackman as one of the highlights of his career. Other collaborators spoke about his preparation, his focus, and the quiet, almost involuntary way he raised the level of every scene around him. The response to his death was immediate, consistent, and deeply felt across an industry that he had largely left behind. Eastwood's words became the center of that response, not because they were the loudest, but because they carried the most specific weight. He had earned the right to make that judgment. He had seen Hackman work from the closest possible distance. He had felt what it was like to be in scenes with someone whose commitment was so total that it changed the nature of the scene itself. And he said plainly that he had never seen anyone do it better. What remains? The full circumstances of what happened in that Santa Fe home may never be completely understood. The questions surrounding the timeline, the isolation, the 2 weeks that passed before anyone came, those may linger without resolution. And in a strange way, that uncertainty fits the man. Hackman spent his life resisting easy explanation. His characters could not be fully categorized or neatly excused. Perhaps, in the end, neither could his departure. What could be said is this: he did the work. He did it honestly, without compromise, without vanity, and without the need for anyone to tell him it was good. He trusted the work to speak for itself, and for 50 years it did, loudly, unmistakably, in ways that continue to define what serious film acting looks like. And when it was over, he stopped. Completely. On his own terms. Clint Eastwood, in a few short sentences spoken after a long silence, acknowledged all of it. He did not reach for metaphor or biography. He reached for the simple truth of what he had witnessed over decades of shared experience. There was no finer actor. Intense. Instinctive. Never a false note. That is the tribute. Not a monument, not a retrospective, not a lifetime achievement reel played at a ceremony. Just the honest judgment of one extraordinary man about another, spoken plainly, at the end the only way either of them ever knew how to speak. What you believe set Gene Hackman apart from every other actor of his generation? And do you think Clint Eastwood is right? Was there truly no one finer? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more stories like this.